see you guys in the dark.
This happened nearly a decade ago now. At the time of this story, I was 15. I'm a male, 5'5", and I was about 132 pounds. I was a wrestler, so I always knew my exact weight and kept myself extremely lean, but still had a fairly muscular build. I live in a fairly small town of 50 to 60,000 people, and in my off-season, I did whatever I could to be somewhat active and outside. I had a friend, let's call him Blaze, who was really into golf and always asked me to come play with him and smoke a doobie while we were in the more secluded parts of the course. He was a couple of years older than me, but no bigger than I was. Just a not-so-great influence for me at the time. This small town only had 2 golf courses, one at a very public park near a middle school, or one at the edge of town in an older park that was much bigger. Obviously, we weren't smoking for everyone to see, so the edge of town sealed-off park it was. Little did I know that on Thursday afternoons, this park happened to be my town spot for gay men to meet and hook up in the parking lot. I live in the Midwest USA, so these were not your stylish, young, pretty guys. It was mostly guys aged 30 to 50 who were pretty big and aggressive yee-yee looking. So we finished the course and the joint, walking out of the woods, anything but sober. We typically either just chilled on the grass or played catch after we finished up until my buddy was more normal and ready to drive back home. We noticed that there were way more cars in the parking lot than when we got there, and a lot of older guys sitting on the trunks of their cars or on the tailgates, loosely grouped together. This very large, hairy man in a tank top and his tall, thin friend dressed like a biker gang member started to do the wolf whistle towards me and my friend. I got pretty uncomfortable, not because gay men whistling at me, but because we had to walk in their direction, and I could feel the eyes of way more men on me than I wanted. For a testosterone-filled, weight room junkie teenager, I did not feel very safe here, knowing there were at least 30 guys in this group. And I could see in my peripheral that a large portion were eyeing us closely as we walked towards the parking lot. I'll make it clear that I'm not a fighter, and I would never intend to hurt anyone aside from self-defense, but I was definitely confident in myself to hold someone off. Us two were just so outnumbered and not in a sober state of mind, so anxiety made things much worse. A couple of them said some gross cat call-like things, more whistles, and that whew noise that rednecks make when they are excited about something or instigating. Similar to a woo, but if Eric Cartman screeched it. I think they had the idea that we were some people that met online and were coming to meet up. Being high, I didn't care what was going on. I just wanted to be safe and not the center of attention. When we got closer, the big hairy man who did the first wolf whistle said something like, "You think you can handle all of this?" And I just mumbled, "No thanks," and tried to keep walking. He yelled back, "What was that, boy?" To which I said, more clearly, "No thanks, I'm not into that stuff." He seemed offended and angry. He said, "Not into what?" All I said was, "Sorry, I'm not gay." And he seemed to be offended by the word gay. Again asking me to repeat myself in a very aggressive tone, so I corrected myself and said that I'm not a homosexual. Things escalated from here real quick. The man stepped forward from leaning against a truck and grabbed my wrist. He said, "We can fix that real quick. Don't get excited." I didn't do some cool fight move to attack him, just a simple wrist roll and using that momentum, a quick push of the elbow to turn him around so that he would have his back to me, and I could get by without anything more. He said, "Touch me like that again, and we will get both of you." Another guy made his way over to Blaze, who was much less the calm and chill type of stoner than I was. I can only describe what he did as one of those kicks or side step-offs a wall, but to that guy's chest abdomen. He started to run and yell, "Fuck off!" Very quickly, a bunch of guys began to stand up from their seats on the outside of their cars and motion our direction. I started booking it for the car too, and Mr. Skinny Biker Man was running right after us. Thank God it was just him running and not multiple chasing us, or the story might be a little different. I was faster than Blaze, so I got ahead of him, and picture us running across a parking lot to his truck that was facing us, backed into a stall. I got around to the passenger side quickly, with Blaze still about 100 feet from the truck. He tried to cut to the right and make it to the driver's side of his little S10, but Skinny cut him off and sent him to the left, passenger side. I ran around the back of the truck as fast as I could to the driver door, and Blaze slid his keys across the roof to me. I hopped in, well aware that I did not want to be driving right now in the state of mind, much less in such a crazy situation, and even more or less someone else's vehicle. Still, without thinking, I started it and skirted out of the parking lot while Skinny banged on the bed of the truck chasing. That's not the end, though. A truck and a car are on their way right behind me. Skinny jumped into the car that was in the back, and the chase began. Terrified and still high, I cut through the grass of the park to get to the main road more quickly, thinking I would lose them that way. These guys raced right over the speed bumps and around the bends in the park road right up to the main road. They were driving so fast, I could have gotten T-boned if I didn't smash the pedal to the floor at the right time. I'm so stressed, I start silently crying while driving, thinking of how horrible the possibilities could be. Contact wearers know that when your eyes are dry, especially from the smoke, then they rapidly get moist. Contacts tend to drift a bit until they find their place again. This is definitely not ideal for someone with awful vision driving twice the speed limit down a road in the middle of town. So I started turning down residential streets and weaving in and out, being tapped on the shoulder by Blaze to keep my speed up because the two were still right on my rear bumper. I even made some risky U-turns, and they followed right along. This chase lasted over 10 minutes of me frantically driving through main streets, residential, back alleyways, and everything that I could try to get away with. I was so scared that the best chase scenario ended up in us getting pulled over and myself obtaining a permit record for DUI by the ripe age of 15. Luckily, a stroke of luck and a surprisingly quick reflex came to my aid. Blaze yelled "cop" and pointed to a parking lot to our left, where there was a police cruiser probably just waiting to catch someone speeding or running red lights on the semi-busy road we ended up on. I whipped into the parking lot and parked a couple stalls down from the cop. The truck prepared to turn, but stopped in the middle of the road. So quickly, once he realized what was going on, the car following him had to swerve and popped a curb, catching the officer's attention. He backed out, and the two vehicles split different ways and were out of sight before he got out of the parking lot. Never went back to that park any time other than the mornings after that. So thankful that nothing bad came of the incident, and we made it out completely unscathed. No idea what they would have done, but people engaging teenagers in a car chase would not have good intentions in mind. It was my first time in my life being sexually harassed, too. You would think being in a car chase might be fun or exciting, but I just felt so powerless, and like I had no control, like nothing I could do would both get these guys away from us and simultaneously not get me arrested. I should also mention that you cannot have a driver's license in my state at the age of 15, so that was another one of my fears of being pulled over. I had farmer's permit that allowed me to drive to work or school, or under the supervision of someone who was 18 or older. For context, both my fiancé and I work at Walmart. We live in a smaller town in Colorado, and right now there's a stage 2 fire ban due to all the fiery shit going on. Meaning, you can't even smoke a cigarette outside without potentially getting a $1,000 fine. Also worth mentioning that because we live in such a small town, the cops and the fire department don't have much else to do than patrol the parking lots for public cigarette smoking. Anyway, we both smoke cigarettes, and both of our cars have different issues right now, so we've been sharing one car. We can only smoke in our cars on our breaks for now. And since he was working and I wasn't, I visited him on his break so that we can spend a few minutes and have a cigarette together. I pulled up to the front of Walmart, and thinking that he would only take a minute to get to me, I put on my emergency lights and waited. After a couple of minutes, a car drives past me, but slows down and rolls his windows down a bit without saying anything. The guy in the car didn't stop, call out, or even stare at me for very long before parking, but something still creeped me out a little bit. I called my fiancé and told him to try and hustle a little bit, mentioning the guy that weirded me out. I understand I had my emergency lights on, but I mean, people do this outside of Walmart for brief amounts of time all day long. And who conveniently breaks down in front of Walmart anyways? While still on the phone with my fiancé, whom I can see walking towards my car from the second entrance at this point, I noticed the guy get out of his car and walk into Walmart through my rear view. But instead of continuing in, he cuts immediately towards the side door that I was parked by. He comes out the side door, and I see him holding what looks like a baseball bat. So I'm freaking out at this point, because this guy starts walking towards my car at the same time my fiancé is also walking up close to my car. Creepy guy gets into the right corner of my hood, standing there with what I can see is a 2 to 3 foot long sword with a sheath over it, looking past my car like he's looking for someone, or pretending to look for someone. This guy also had a fucking assortment of knives that slid into a belt around his waist. I managed only a few glances at his face without trying to be noticed, but I could definitely tell this guy was on drugs. Hard to tell which one, but I could guess meth based on his eyes and paranoid actions. Fiancé finally approaches the passenger door when Meth Man turns to him, and I'm ready to lay on the horn or something as a distraction. But the Meth Man surprisingly doesn't do anything, but spontaneously walk past him, and fiancé finally gets into my car. This guy just keeps walking. I pull away and park further into the parking lot. My fiancé and I talk a little bit about how scared we both were, not knowing what the hell this guy was doing. A little more terrifying, my car had been giving me trouble on the way there, and so I test drive it around the lot with my fiancé during his break, only proving the problem more urgent. My fiancé was only on a 15-minute break, so I had him call our police department and report this, just asking them to come check it out since he had 2 hours left, and I was tripping out after Meth Man had seen both our faces. I was scared that he might follow my love into Walmart with his fucking sword and try something, or follow me home. He saw my car, my license plate, and both of us drive around the lot during our test drive. After the cops came and tracked my fiancé down in the aisle that he was stalking, they got the description and immediately knew who he was. Turns out they knew where he lived. It was in a trailer park across the street from Walmart, and they actually had been watching out for him because of a previous incident with a security guard at our store. The incident went like this. Security guard stopped him for something. Guy came back a few days later and asked the security guard, "What are you still doing in my town?" To which the security guard replied, "What do you mean? I live here." Not for long. Like, what the fuck? I feel like it's also important to mention that we live in a small tourist attraction town, and the local population is predominantly rich, older people, because it's a nice retirement town, but it's very expensive here. You see people strapping AKs to their Jeeps, no kidding, but not meth heads with swords. Anyways, I guess they found him in the parking lot, and warned him that if he was seen around Walmart again, let alone carrying anything larger than a 10-inch knife, he was going to be arrested. Haven't seen him since, and I'm glad. Guns are scary, no doubt, but in our town, a lot of people keep them on their waist, so it's not as alarming. However, creepy, drugged-looking man with a 2-foot sword in his hand, I really don't want to see you ever again. This happened a few years ago. For context, I live in England. I was 23 at the time. I had come out of a seriously long relationship at 22. We were engaged, and I was absolutely broken. I didn't even think about dating, or any type of love interest for a year at least. I had worked hard to put myself back together, and had been a counselor, and was taking anti-anxiety medication. I decided that it was time to try and find love once again. Big mistake. I met a man on Tinder. He was 27 and seemed really friendly, and we hit it off really quickly. We went on a fair few dates and saw each other for a few months. As the relationship progressed, he started to get more and more possessive. He didn't like the fact I had my own job, my own friends, my own house, or a close relationship with my family. I knew I had to cut things off quickly because it was becoming too much to handle, and I could not survive another horrific relationship experience. I was already too fragile. I told him that I still wasn't ready to get serious with someone and needed to spend more time alone to look after myself. He took it well until he reached his own home, and then the texts and the phone calls started. He called me all sorts of horrendous names, and then would come back with saying how he's not worthy, how I'm amazing, and he's just devastated that he's lost me. I firmly told him that I had meant what I had said, and that things were not going to happen. He accepted this for a little while. I started getting ads on various social media that were fake accounts he had made. He called me on various numbers, withheld numbers, public phone numbers. He turned up on my drive without warning. He turned up at my place of work and harassed a colleague. I threatened him with police action if he did not stop, and I moved back in with my parents as I did not feel safe at home. For months he tried to contact me through various ways, and it became exhausting trying to block him from my life. Then one day he changed his tactics. My grandfather had recently passed away, and we were very close, so I visited his grave weekly to put flowers on it and sit and think. I arrive one morning, and there is a letter on the grave. Only myself and my family ever go there, so I was very confused. It was from Jay, begging me to take him back, telling me he would do anything and everything to make me his again. It got threatening towards the end, and I decided that enough was enough. This had just gone too far. I contacted the police and had a restraining order put in place. I am still not confident enough to date again. I guess you could say that I am scarred. I'm a student, and I live with 3 other people in a house in a quiet town about 20-minute walk and a bus ride away from the university. By quiet, I mean that there are no clubs or anything, and our neighbors are mostly retired folks and young families. Our house is the exception to the rule. There is not an enormous homeless problem around here, but it is massive in the next town over. This happened in February, so not that long ago. So one Wednesday night, one of my housemates decided that she wanted to go to a club night that they have every week at the university. Initially, she said that she was planning to stay at one of her friends' houses, but apparently this friend hooked up with someone pretty early on, so she was going to come home after all. Being the good introvert friend that I was, I told her that I'd wait for her to get back before I went to bed, since I was the only one in the house that evening, and I wanted to make sure that her drunk ass got into bed safely. She told me that she wouldn't be too late, and that she'd definitely be back by midnight, which was good since that's when they turn off the street lamps in our street. This makes everything pitch black and terrifying. I accidentally discovered this one day, though fortunately I had a torch on me at the time. This will be important in a moment. I was sitting in the kitchen, waiting, while my housemate messaged me her progress. Finally, she messaged me that she was on our street, and I got up to unbolt and unlock the door. By this time, it's actually 5 minutes past midnight, since apparently drunk girls don't walk remarkably fast. So the street lamps are all off, but she's already on our street. And the hallway light was on, so I wasn't worried about her finding her way. When I opened the door, my housemate is making her way merrily up the driveway, so I patiently hold the door. Just as she reaches the bottom of the stairs, I notice some guy turning onto our driveway, completely perpendicular to the path. There was no logical reason to do this other than to come to our house. My heart stopped, and I basically dragged my housemate into the house and slammed the door shut. I turned all the locks, including the deadbolt, and stood about 6 feet back between my friend and the door, as if it was about to swing open. After that, I closed all of the curtains on the ground floor and checked the other windows and doors to make sure that they were secure. Now, after the guy didn't knock or try to break down the door or anything dramatic, but all I could think of was how long had he been following her, and what would he have done if the door hadn't been shut when he reached it. Annoyingly, my drunk housemate was annoyed at me for pulling her in, and apparently stretching her jumper. Now, she was pretty tipsy at this point, so her judgment wasn't 100%. But when I tried to sit her down and explain what I'd seen, she first insisted that I hadn't seen anything, and when I persisted, she said that it was probably just a homeless guy who wanted to ask for money. She then went to bed as if nothing was wrong. though she allowed me to keep the hallway lights on all night after a bit of persuasion. Anyways, since I knew that the house was a fortress, and that my housemate definitely wasn't planning to back up my story to the police, I let it go without reporting it. Honestly, she's halfway convinced me that I had imagined it, and or was overreacting at this point. However, I still keep the door deadbolted whenever I'm alone in the house, even if it's in the middle of the day. When I was 17, I made a dodgy decision in quitting school. Mainly this was due to my parents, my mom and stepdad, moving from Elizabethtown to New Albany, which infuriated me, and I found it selfish for many reasons. New Albany had always depressed me, but when I visited, I was fully creeped out, but also fascinated. Everything was rotting and industrial, or rotting and Victorian. Events would transpire that would cause my dad, a military-based chef, to become disabled and force me to move in with my mom and my new stepdad. I promptly got a job and began sleeping in an upstairs room. There were many strange, sometimes terrifying things that would happen in the time that I lived in that city. An incident that kind of marked the beginning. When I was still getting used to the city, it happened one night before I was supposed to go to work. We lived in one of the many older houses that were long, a bit crammed together, with an alley behind the houses for trash and vehicle, garage access kind of stuff. I remember how those alleys stank of garbage in the summertime. One of my sisters, Elizabeth, had complained several times of seeing shadows and hearing rushed footsteps in the street behind the house. We all only paid polite attention to her complaints. She was known for complaining a lot that she experienced paranormal incidents, and we assumed that this was one of them. We all just got kind of annoyed, because we were awakened several times during the night with her saying that she saw someone lurking outside the fence, or near the garage in the back alley. I had work the next day, and was particularly irritated, taking away the number of hours of sleep that I could get with each disturbance. Finally, I told her I would sleep downstairs if it made her feel better. There were many windows in these old houses to let the sun in. I reasoned that I would see the sentry light come on if somebody was lurking in any part of the yard on either side of the house. Well, I was wrong. I woke instead to a short series of bangs on the iron wrought screen door, hard enough to rattle it and make the windows shake. I got up, bleary and admittedly scared, but resigned to look out the door's glass frame. My stepdad reached it before me. I was relieved. He was an ex-Marine and scared of very little, but I wanted to look brave, so I went to the door next to him. A man stood in the doorway, shadowed due to the sentry light. He was somewhere in his 20s, had a neck beard, and very haggard look despite wearing clothes that looked well kept. He was standing with a stillness that was disturbing. Stepdad hollered a simple, "What?" at the man without actually opening the door. The man said nothing, but raised his hand to his mouth, tilted an imaginary cup with his lips. We took this to mean that he wanted water, and we fetched him a glass quickly. He drank it without saying a word, and then stood on the porch for several minutes until Stepdad got impatient and said that it's 4 a.m., we want to go back to bed. The man's still face was broke into a pained grimace, so extreme that it was both comical and scary. It was horrible, deranged wine. He said that I am full of demons, and I ate my mom tonight. He then broke into a fit of wheezing sobs. My stepdad said, "You need to fucking leave," and slammed the door in the man's face. He called the cops as I watched the man walk into the middle of the road in front of the house and sit arms over his knees. The cops came and talked to the man. They told us that he lived down the road and that everything was fine. They told us nothing other than that. That morning, I checked the backyard and made sure that the dogs were secure before I got ready for work. My sisters were also getting ready for school. As I was putting on my uniform, I heard one of my sisters scream. I ran to the kitchen where she was, which faced the backyard. It was my older sister, Reno, and she pointed out and told me that she had just watched the door leading into the garage open up. Sure enough, it was open, a head's width at least. After I had just shut it and checked all the other doors and gates out back, The dogs were going nuts. It was just me and my sisters at this point, and the only weapon that I had was a cane sword that belonged to my grandfather. It was dull, but I still handed it to my sister, telling her a good whack or poke from it would probably fuck somebody up. She decided to follow me, maybe emboldened by the dog and our weapons. I opted to take its encasing, which was a hard piece of iron with a flared pommel where the blade would fit in. We approached the garage, probably being stupid, and attempted to peer into the crack in the door. The lights inside were on. We heard a loud bang from inside, and I went forward, swinging the cane in as ruthless of a strike as I could muster, but only hitting the frame of the broken-down car inside. The door on the other side was open, and my dog took her chance to run out it after the intruder. I looked behind me and saw the cane sword abandoned on the ground, and guessed Reno had booked it back inside. After much searching, I found the dog terrorizing another dog behind a fence. No sign of anybody the entire time that I searched. We told our parents, but they kind of just dismissed everything. They said that I probably had forgotten to lock the door, and it came open, and that the mother eater wasn't really dangerous. They were more worried about the dog escaping and hurting somebody. We rarely ever actually saw the mother eater after that. We stopped being scared and would laugh when he was brought up, joking about what he could have possibly meant by saying that he had eaten his mother. Our last encounter with him was years later. We found that he was walking up and down the road most of the day in July. When it got dark, me and Elizabeth were sitting up watching Fruits Basket when we heard a series of loud moans. I sniggered, and she pulled a disgusted face. We thought that it was my parents having loud sex or something, until my stepfather came stampeding down the stairs, and the moans turned into screams that sounded like "No! No! No!" over and over again. Outside there was a commotion of flashlights and many people. We watched as two people came into our yard and seemed to be searching for something with flashlights. They ran back to the road as the police pulled up and gathered around the cop car. This incident was never explained to us. The police just said there was an incident, but we never heard of or saw the mother eater again after that, though plenty more happened in New Albany. So, to the demon guy who ate your mom, I hope it all turned out okay, for both you and your mother. But I really hope that I don't see you again, and same goes for you, New Albany. 2 years ago, I was working for a company as a person who measures houses. Most people haven't heard of it. It's where you essentially have an iPad, and you go to people's homes, draw up floor plans, and measure rooms from carpet, hardwood flooring projects. Anyone can request one. I'm female, and I was 25 at the time. One of the few females that worked at this position. I was actually really, really good at the job, so they gave me a lot of work, and I usually hit between 10 to 14 houses a day, driving all over multiple towns. This house was my last house of the day, in the middle of nowhere, and I was exhausted. When I got there, I was incredibly annoyed because the customer wasn't home and was late for his appointment. 10 minutes later, he pulls up next to my car. He was a middle-aged man, balding, wearing a normal office job attire with a tie and everything. He seemed a bit awkward, but was apologetic and let me into his home. Upon entering, the house was unbelievably spotless and organized, minimal furniture, and smelled like cleaning supplies. It didn't strike me as odd at first. He had 2 cats lounging in the living room. He first started acting weird as I was directed to the first bedroom. He mentioned, "Wow, my cats love you. They don't take to strangers like this usually." But his cats literally didn't move or come near me the whole time. I just nodded and smiled while I got to work, scaling out the master bedroom on my iPad. He started inquiring about the electronics that I was using. "Do they keep track of where you are at those things?" Immediate red flag. "Yes, and my boss knows how long each job should take based on the scope of work. It's incredible technology, really." I lied without missing a beat. He agreed that it was amazing. "Be careful, don't touch the gun on the nightstand. It might go off," he chuckled. Talk about immediate spine chill. I looked up from my iPad, and sure enough, there was a handgun on the nightstand. I knew instantly that I needed to behave like nothing that was happening was triggering alarms for me. He directed me to the second bedroom, and he said the exact same thing, warning me of a gun on the nightstand that indeed was there. This was the moment that I knew I was in danger. At first, I thought it was just my anxiety around guns, but at this point, the tension building between us was undeniable. There were only 2 bedrooms on the scope of work. I hastily met up with him in the kitchen and began running down the next steps, but he interrupted me. "Could you measure the basement stairs? I forgot to add them to my list, and I think I might want to carpet them in the future." My heart dropped, but my stupid customer service conditioned brain could not figure out how to get away with saying no. He led me to the basement door, and I kid you not, there is no way he was planning on doing anything with these stairs. They were plank wooden stairs, L-shaped, going down, leading to an unfinished basement. Unfortunately, in order to get an accurate measure, I had to walk all the way down them to the basement. Meanwhile, he stood blocking the door with a smile on his face, mentioning again about whether or not my boss knew where I was, to which I shortly replied yes. Once I got to the basement, I scanned the room quickly. There was not 1, but 7 deep freezers lining the walls. In the middle of the room was a lit, low-hanging ceiling light, revealing an old television set, VHS tapes scattered on the floor, and an old recliner facing the TV. Behind the set, 2 white shelves full of VHS tapes. In this moment, I knew one of 2 things was going to happen. He was either going to let me go, or he was going to push me down the fucking stairs. I held my breath, put a smile on my face in an attempt to act my way out of the situation, and began to climb the stairs. All I could hear was my heartbeat in my ears. He was still blocking the door. No smile this time. As I got to about the 5th stair from the top, I felt him hesitate, which made me hesitate as well. You could cut the tension with a knife, and I finally understood that expression, to my absolute shock and relief. After 4 seconds, he stepped aside. I made a beeline towards the front door, not saying a word when he stopped me again, saying, "Oh, before you go, won't you give my cats a treat? They loved you so much." He was holding a bag of cat treats. I quickly gave his cats a treat, thanked him, and practically ran out of the house, and definitely ran to my car. The second I got out of his driveway, I had the most intense panic attack, and I cried. I tried to call my boss, but I was in a dead zone. The truth of the matter is that my boss would not have noticed I was missing for at least 24 hours when I didn't route my day the next workday. Yes, he would have eventually been caught, as it was my last known location, but I would have been long dead by then. I suffered PTSD over this experience. I couldn't sleep for a week, and I was petrified to work my job, but I had no choice. This day still haunts me. The worst part, I was so messed up, jumbled, and in denial over the experience, I forgot to write down his address. A lot of people are doubting this story. There are some additional facts about the day that I have to answer to most of my common questions I'm getting. And I'm getting tired of repeating answers to people. Once I finally did get a hold of my boss, she mostly laughed off the situation as him being some weirdo. Nonetheless, she did tell me she would flag him so that I would specifically not be resent out to his house if there was a need for any remeasuring. At the time, I felt like that was all there was to be done, so I didn't write down the address before it disappeared on my iPad, because I felt I didn't need to, or did not really think to. A couple of months later, I did try to find the information, because I started feeling like maybe I should inform the police. But no matter who I called, since I was not sure of the exact day, I could not get the information. Additionally, I was working 40 hours a week, hitting 10 to 14 houses a day. No way I could look in that Waze history to find the address after a couple of months. For what it's worth, once I was out of the dead zone, I also called my boyfriend, and immediately went to his house for comfort. He witnessed the immediate aftermath. All of my friends have known this experience, and I was encouraged to write it here after a recent conversation about it. I just don't want to ever go through anything like that ever again. I love my wife above all else. I have loved her since the moment I first laid eyes on her. I would do anything for her, and that has never changed after all of these years. We first met in college, We were both theater majors, and it was day one of acting class that our eyes met for the first time. She had chocolate brown eyes that were complemented by her dark brown curls. We stared at each other constantly that first day, and when we were partnered together, we knew that it was fate. "My name is Margaret," she said as soon as I walked up to her after class. I took her by her hand and kissed it. "Henry," I responded. She then took one of my long dreadlocks and wrapped it around her finger, staring me in the eyes and biting her lip. It was an amazing meeting, with an even better ending later that night. The following night, we went on our first date, a theater production of Sueno. We held each other's hands through the entire performance, and afterwards, I walked her to her dormitory. Every day after that was like a love story. We went through good times and bad times. We broke up and got back together. Through it all, one thing never changed for me. I loved her and would do anything for her. We got married after graduation and went to become very successful in the stage acting scene. We were considered a power couple and were always cast in romantic roles opposite each other. It was easy to bring the true, deep love that we felt for each other to the stage, and it was nice to make money from it. One day, our lives took a turn. We had a different successful performance of the stage play, The Clean House, when we were approached by a member of the audience. "That was an amazing performance," he said, a creepy English accent behind his words. "Why, thank you. You're sweet," said Margaret, gripping my hand. I could tell this guy had creeped her out, but being a talented actress, she was able to put on a nice front. "I've been watching you two for a very long time," he continued, his pale blue eyes staring into Margaret. "I'm very much a fan of your work. Every performance is riveting, and I can tell that you put true passion into your exchanges. You two must truly love each other." "We do," I said, stepping slightly in front of Margaret. "We love each other very much. I would do anything for her." I looked at her, and she gave me that beautiful smile of hers. "That warms my heart to hear," he said, as he put his arms behind his back and looking up into the night sky. "True love is a valuable gift that is often taken for granted. If you're not careful, you can easily lose it forever, and it can never be replaced, no matter how hard you try." He then looked at me, and I could see just how disturbing his pale blue eyes were. "Hold on to that gift. Cherish it forever." He began to walk away before I asked the question that had been bothering me since we met. "Who are you?" I yelled. He stopped and turned his head. "Your biggest fan," he answered. Then he walked away. Margaret and I looked at each other, baffled at what had just taken place. Later that night, we were sitting on our couch, watching a movie, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. "I wonder who that could be," said Margaret, as she got up to see who it was. She looked at the peephole and froze in place before taking a single step back and opening the door. Standing just outside the door was the same man we had talked to earlier that night. He stood there with his arms behind him, his pale blue eyes shining like the moon. "Honey," I said, standing up from the couch to join Margaret at the door. "Please, come in," Margaret said to the man, to my shock. "What are you doing?" I yelled, running to get to the door. The man stepped inside before I got there and began to stroke her face. When I finally got to him, I threw my fist and connected with his face, knocking him back outside. I quickly slammed the door and locked it. I turned to Margaret, who was in the same sort of trance. I tried to snap her out of it. "Margaret," I yelled, shaking her. "Margaret, wake up!" There was nothing that I could do to get her to respond. I shook her, I slapped her, even splashed water in her face. Nothing would work. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. I looked around until I saw the silhouette of a man standing outside our living room window. I blinked, and it was gone. I began to panic and ran to the gun safe in our bedroom. Despite being theater nerds, we were very well trained in self-defense and firearms. We could hold our own if our lives were in danger. And if there was ever a time to put that training to use, it was now. When I got back to the living room, I immediately raised my weapon. There stood the strange man, holding Margaret by the face. "Let go of her, motherfucker," I yelled, aiming for his head. He looked at me, and the only thing I could see in the darkness was glowing red eyes. He then turned his head to Margaret and I fired, hitting him directly in the head. He fell to the floor hard, and I ran over to Margaret. Margaret fell over too, but I caught her before she hit the ground. She still would not respond, her eyes wide open in a trance. I looked over to the man, but he was gone. I gently laid her on the floor and stood up quickly, readying my weapon once again. Suddenly, I felt a strong grip, a tight grip on the back of my neck, and I was then thrown across the room, hitting the wall. I groaned in pain as I grabbed my gun and slowly stood to my feet, shaking as I raised my weapon again. Again, he had a hold of Margaret, but this time he pulled her head close to his. I felt my heart race and my blood boil as he put her lips to his glowing red eyes staring right at me. "No!" I screamed as I ran towards them. He then pushed her to the side and opened his arms to me, as if inviting me to fire on him once again. I obliged and fired 5 rounds into him, but all he did was allow them to connect as he laughed. I ran up to him, but he grabbed me by the throat before I could do anything. He pulled me close to his face, and I could see every horrifying feature. Not only did he have demon-like eyes, but his face was covered in distinguishing, pulsating veins. In his mouth were 2 sharp fangs and a long, slimy tongue, which rubbed against my face, as if tasting me before taking his first bite. I lifted my gun to my arm that had a hold of me and fired twice. He growled in pain as he released me, and I connected the butt of my gun to his face repeatedly. He fell to the floor, and I mounted him, smashing his face more and more, harder and faster. I could feel the blood gush and spray all over the bones in his skull, cracking and collapsing. By the time I was done, there was nothing but smashed bones, brains, and blood. I panted as I stood back and limped over to Margaret, who was now fully unconscious. I shook her, and she finally opened up her eyes, looking into mine with fear and confusion. "Margaret," I said, feeling relieved that she was all right. I held her close, and we laid there until I looked over to where the body of the stranger would have been. He was gone, and panic arose once again, and we both stood up quickly. I turned to face Margaret and screamed when I saw him standing behind her, still in the process of regenerating his face. Before I had a chance to react, he sunk his fangs deep into Margaret's neck. She screamed in pain as I screamed in rage, hitting the monster in the skull once again with my gun. I felt bone crack again as he released her. Again I mounted him and went back to work, growing exhausted the longer I went. I knew this wouldn't last, as he would surely regenerate once again. It soon became obvious what exactly I was dealing with. He had put Margaret into a trance merely by looking at her, even looking through a peephole. It wasn't until he invited himself in that he actually got in. He had glowing red eyes and fangs, and he bit Margaret in the neck. He's a goddamn vampire, I thought to myself. While he was down, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed my old wooden brook. I broke it in half and ran it into his body. I rammed it as hard as I could directly into his heart. The body began to convulse and flail its arms and legs all over. Suddenly, it stopped and went completely limp before melting into deep red blood and other disgusting fluids. After catching my breath, I slowly turned my attention to Margaret. She sat there in the darkness, legs folded and upper torso full erect. "Honey," I said, nervously approaching her. In the darkness, I could only see her silhouette, until her eyes began to slowly glow red. There was only one thing I could think of to do. I love my wife. I would do anything for her, even if that meant chaining her up in the basement, feeding her a pint of my own blood every day while I figured out what to do about her. When the hunger would hit her, she became like a wild animal that could not communicate with me. So I fed her my blood, and she became herself once again. She understood the situation and never held it against me. It wasn't easy, but it was all that we could do. Unfortunately, a pint only went so far, until soon it wasn't enough. So I gave her more and more, until the point that I was endangering myself with so much blood loss. It was then that I decided to feed her full meals. It started with small animals at first, and then cats and dogs. Soon I made the hard decision to invite homeless people into our home knock them out, and give them to her. This went on for far too long before it really started to affect us. She felt like a monster, and I did as well. I love my wife. I would do anything for her. Which brings me to now. I'm sitting here writing this, shaking. There is literally blood on my hands as I try to compose myself. She asked me to do one last thing for her. I refused at first, because I love her so much. "If you love me," she began, looking me deep in my eyes, her now pale blues not blinking, "you will do this." Tears fell from both of our eyes as I pulled her in close. "I love you, Margaret," I whispered. "I love you, Henry," she responded. I would hear the squish as I drove the wooden stake in her heart. I trembled as I listened to her whimpers, gasps, and eventually silence. I broke down as her body melted away into liquid. I laid there in her remains, sobbing. I sit here now, with nothing left but the warning about the creatures of fiction that are very much a reality. I write my confession of the crimes that I have committed out of love. I say goodbye to any friends or loved ones that may be reading this. I loved her, and I did everything for her. This happened to me on New Year's Eve a year ago. I was at this party where a bunch of friends had gathered just to hang out, eat, and celebrate together. Nothing crazy in particular happened during the event itself, but rather when I was on my way home. As I was walking along the sidewalk, I think it must have been 3 a.m. or something, I saw this middle-aged man coming in my direction. I thought little of it, as I assumed he was merely passing, until I noticed that he started to slow down as we neared each other. I think he smiled at me as I walked past him. Not a crazy smile or anything, so I just smiled back. Just as I thought that I'd just been stupidly suspicious about this man, I heard him calling out from behind me, like he was calling after me. I stopped in my tracks and faced him to see what he wanted, and I saw him walking back towards me, his arms outstretched. As he stopped in front of me, he reached out his hand, as if he wanted to shake mine. This was when I began to get a little more apprehensive about the situation. I'm sure he must have noticed how I hesitated before I decided to shake his hand. I don't want to be a suspicious person, but I considered the possibility that he might be concealing a knife in the sleeves of his coat, that he might try to mug me or even try to kill me. I thought about what would happen if I started running away. Would he just shrug and continue on his way, or would he follow me? All this flashed through my mind until I decided to take his hand. I thought that I would pull myself away free and run the hell away from there if it proved necessary. He then started asking me stuff about what I've been doing this New Year's Eve, if I had a good time, just everyday things like that. He was shaking my hand all the while, and even though I was still on the edge, I started to realize that this man didn't pose a threat to me. For politeness' sake, I asked him if he had a good time too. After a short while, he let go of my hand, said Happy New Year, and went down the sidewalk. He was probably under the influence of alcohol at the time, but he must have been one of those people who became happy when they're drunk. I felt really stupid, but relieved too, as I continued on my own way home. In the end, he didn't mean me any harm. I actually thought he was just kind of sweet for asking a random stranger if they had a good night celebrating, to be honest. Yet, I'll never forget this indecisiveness and spark of fear that ran through me at the moment he stretched out his hands to me. This happened on New Year's Eve 2 years ago. My best friend and I were going to my friend's house to celebrate. My friend lives in what many would consider the boonies. After taking an exit off the interstate, you reach a small city, make a left turn, travel through a smaller town, then get into a highway for a few miles before exiting onto the country road. This county road goes on for miles. Roughly 30 minutes of driving, before you reach her house, which is at the end of this dead end. Now that I've given an idea of the setting, I'll explain what happened. I was riding in the passenger seat with my friend driving. 2 of my other friends were in the car in front of us. Everything was normal at first, until we exited onto the highway. I didn't think anything of it until the truck also got off the highway, and turns off to the other roads and residential areas before you reach the dead end. Additionally, it is deep in the woods, and has no street lights. This will be important later on. So we drive further down the road, and I become easy because the truck still hasn't turned down a side road. I mentioned this to my friend, but she just said that they probably live further down the road. We keep driving, and the truck starts flashing their brights on and off at us, and riding the back of our car unnecessarily close. We assumed this was to trick us into thinking something was wrong and pulling over, which was obviously not what we were going to do. I started freaking out and called our friends in front of us to let them know. They basically brushed it off, said we were overreacting. I hoped that was the case, but what happened next amped my fear and anxiety up to 100. I looked back and with a sigh of relief told my friend the truck must have turned off a different road because the lights were gone. However, upon closer inspection in the side mirror, I could make out the silhouette of the truck. It was still behind us. They just turned their lights off completely. There is no logical reason why someone would do this on a dark and winding country road. At this point, I was honestly thinking we might die. I called my friends in front of us again and told them that the truck had now turned off their lights. We were deep into the woods at this point, and cell reception was abysmal, so I had to call them several times before they understood what I said. Luckily, my friend whose house we were going to exhibited some quick thinking and told us to follow her. When we rounded a corner, we made a sharp right turn down a long circle drive and shut our lights off. The truck didn't see us round the corner and kept driving down the road instead. We ended up waiting a few minutes and saw the truck come back the other direction before we felt safe enough to go to the house. Luckily, nothing more came of this situation. But to the creepy New Year's stalker, I hope that you don't try to follow us again. So it started when I was around 15 years old. That was about 8 years ago. I was dating a girl from about 2 towns over. I would usually get the train to hers and back. However, this one night her family weren't supposed to be home, and we were kind of being watched by her brother, who was about 19 to 20 and was pretty chill. The plan was to stay the night. We were up late playing on the Wii, but her parents unexpectedly came home. I never got along with her mother, and the whole thing got kind of heated, and I was kicked out of the house, told that I couldn't stay over. It was about 2 a.m., and I didn't want to call my own parents in worrying of waking them up, so I began the long trudge home. It was roughly about an hour and a quarter worth of walking, so I was expected to be home around 4:30. So I walked along the weird concrete bit just above the beach, not sure what it's called, and I stopped after about half an hour of walking as there is a public toilet which is kind of run down, but also open 24 hours, and I was pretty desperate. I was expecting it to be empty, or just have a homeless dude sleeping in it. I was wrong. There was a guy using the urinal. This guy looked to be in his mid to late 50s, a little on the overweight side. He had gray, messy-ish hair, but other than that, he looked pretty normal. He definitely didn't look homeless. I remember that he made a quick joke about something, but I don't remember what it was. I laughed, did my business, and left. After about 15 minutes of walking, the weather had gotten pretty bad. It started to rain heavy, and the wind was picking up. I seem to remember this was around November time, so it was pretty cold. Anyways, I'm walking, and a car drives by, beeps, and then pulls over in front of me. I had assumed that it was someone I knew, but couldn't think who it would be. Got to the car, and the dude from the toilet was inside. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him. He said that was a long walk, and I couldn't be expected to walk all that way in the weather, and he offered me a lift. In hindsight, I probably should have refused, but the weather was bad, and at the time, he wasn't giving off any weird vibes. The drive took about 15 minutes, maybe 20. The more I was in the car with him, the more I started to get vibes that were something off about this guy. He was telling me his best friend was a 14-year-old lad who stays over at his place a lot. They drink together, and if I ever wanted to join, I was welcome to come. He was asking me some really invasive questions as well. I don't fully remember what they were. I just remember it's not the kind of questions that you ask somebody that you're giving a simple lift home to. Anyways, we got to the street around the corner from my place, and I asked him to just drop me off there. I told him my house wasn't accessible by the road, and that I would walk the rest of the way. He gave me his number and told me to ring him when I got back to my house safely, as he wanted to make sure that I got home okay. I asked him what his name was. He said his name was Pete. I said, Pete, what? My phone wants a surname. He wouldn't tell me what it was. He just kept saying, call me Pete. Anyways, I got into my house, texted him, just to let him know that I was home safe. It was probably a bad decision, but back then I was full of bad decisions. The next day came, and I was expecting everything to go back to normal. It didn't, because I stupidly gave Pete my number when I texted him. Started to get texts from him every morning, basically, just saying good morning to me, and wishing me well. I replied to the first few, and then started ignoring them. He then started trying to ring me, every single evening. I would ignore most of his calls, but he would just often repeatedly ring until I answered. He was sending me these texts inviting me over to his house for some drinks. He kept telling me that he'd just gotten himself a pool table and wanted to come and play it with me. He was telling me a story of a friend he was playing pool with and accidentally let slip that the guy called him John. I told him, I thought your name was Pete. He said, oh, no, my friend's name is John. I said that you just said that your friend called you John, and you told me that your friend was called Tom. He said, oh, well, some people call me John. I guess it's kind of like a nickname, but his name is John too. He hesitated saying this, and I kind of clicked that he was telling me a bunch of lies. I kept refusing, but he kept asking. After a while, my mom wanted to know who this dude was who kept texting me and ringing me. I told her, and she rang him herself from her phone and told him that if he carried on texting and ringing me, that she would be calling the police. I didn't get any more texts from him after that, but it didn't end there. I had a routine, you see, and he knew it. I always walked my dog at 4 every afternoon and played with her for 40 minutes on the field at the end of the street, just near where he had dropped me off. I started to notice his car pulling up there within 5 minutes of me getting there with my dog. He had tinted windows, but I would always notice the car lights were always left on, and the engine was always running. Also, I recognized his car. I would occasionally notice the car door open and a large flash from that direction as if someone was taking pictures. I started changing the time that I walked my dog, but he would eventually figure it out and start showing up either earlier or late to coincide when I was walking her. This went on for months, and I never mentioned it to anyone. But one day, it just stopped. He stopped pulling up at the side of the field. I never saw his car anymore. Not text messages or phone calls from him. It all just stopped. I ended up getting a new phone after about a year, and had that for another 2 years. I dug out my old phone, and when I was around 18 or 19, after the aforementioned dog died, I had some old photos and videos of her on that phone, and I wanted to transfer them over to my PC so that I would always have them. I turned on a phone which had been switched off for several years now, and still had the old SIM in it. That's when I got my final message from Pete. It was an odd one, and was about 14 months old. It said something along the lines of, "Hi, I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I just thought that I would let you know that over New Year's, I was diagnosed with an illness, and I've been told that I don't have long left to live. You were a good friend in the short time that we knew each other. I live at," and he sent me his address, "and would really appreciate it if you would come around just so that I could have one last chat with you. I've got some beers in, and if it gets too late, you can stay the night. Just drop me a phone call when you want to come around so that I can get everything ready for you. See you soon." No idea if Pete or John was genuinely ill or just trying to lure me to his house. Never been to the address he sent me and never responded to him or heard from him since. I didn't reply to him, and that was the last that I heard from the guy. So yeah, that's pretty much the story. Not tremendously exciting, but it kind of had a big impact on me during those years. When I was 13, I broke my leg in a nasty bicycle accident. I ended up in a plaster cast from my hip to my ankle for about 8 weeks. As it was coming up to Christmas, my younger brother wanted to go to the theater to see a Christmas show. I was 13, moody, and accompanied by a bright pink cast everywhere I went. I was not feeling it. My dad, never one for going to the theater, offered to take me to a Pizza Hut instead. It was a rare opportunity to spend time with my dad, who was often working very long hours. He worked as a police officer, which at the time I didn't really take an interest in what he did. We had a great evening at Pizza Hut, and we got back into the car to go home with full bellies and some leftover pizza. I remember babbling away to my dad as I had been the whole night, enthralled that I had my dad's undivided attention. After a while, I noticed he wasn't really responding anymore. We were fairly near home, but still on the main roads before we turned off towards our housing estate. At first, I thought he had just lost interest, but I glanced across and noticed he was permanently looking in the rearview mirror. I asked him what was up, and he said the car behind us has followed us all the way from Pizza Hut. I glanced behind and commented that we were still on the main roads. I couldn't see that this was an unusual route for this guy to take. He said I need to see whether he is. I don't want to lead this guy to our house. I rolled my eyes. My dad was always paranoid about stuff like that. We couldn't even tell friends we were going on holiday because he was convinced the house would be broken into while we were away. We were coming up to a residential area before ours that I knew from doing a paper route. I suggested the street coming up on the left, as it looped around in a horseshoe shape through a housing estate, and brings you back out on the same main road we were on, just further up. Nobody would take this road to come out onto the main road again. My dad turned off, and so did the car. I will never forget that feeling, that sinking feeling as I watched the car sharply turn behind ours. The car placed its full beams on. I let out a gasp and looked to my dad. He's gone into work mode. He had completely shut me out. He accelerated down the street, and as we came to the main road, I saw there were many cars still on that main road. He pulled straight out onto the main road, meaning the car coming on the main road needed to brake sharply, and held down their horn at us. I kept my eyes on the road, ahead, breathing deeply as my dad weaved in and out of the lanes. A part of me was completely terrified, and a part of me was still convinced this was not really happening, that he had exaggerated or mistaken this. He wasn't really following us. I dared to look in the side mirror and saw it was a different car behind us. I felt myself relax a little bit. We turned left at the coming roundabout, giving very little room to anyone, and a few moments of holding my breath, thinking that we were going to hear the sound of metal on metal. The street we had turned on to was slightly quieter than the road previous. I slowly glanced into the side mirror, and it was still a different car behind us. I sighed a relief and thought this had really been my dad's imagination. Suddenly, the rearview mirror became completely illuminated again, and I awkwardly turned in my seat to see a car pull out sharply from behind the car behind us, and pull in quickly behind ours again. I looked to my dad yet again. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and told me to call someone in particular in his phone and put it on speaker. My hands were shaking. I could barely press the buttons. A cheerful voice answered, and before he could say anything else, my dad quickly summarized what was happening. There was a pause, and I could hear voices speaking in the background, radios beeping and answering through radios. My dad had barked at me to keep naming the streets we were on to the guy on the phone, as my dad randomly turned down the streets, trying to keep on to the main road. I'm randomly calling names and trying to remember to say the direction that we were heading. The car was so close behind us and completely blinding any view behind us. All I could think was, please don't hit us. If we crash, I cannot run. What the hell can I do? My leg had only just been plastered. I knew that I stood no chance. I suddenly wondered if we were getting close enough to take a shot at us. This for me was unthinkable. It was in England. That is not the normal. Why the hell would someone want to shoot us? We continued to weave down the streets, in random turns as I was tossed around the front seat, clutched onto the mobile that was in my trembling hands. The voice on the phone shouted, "Turn into the Tesco car park. That's coming up to the left, that we have 3 response vehicles coming from the other direction." My dad sharply turned into the car park. Skipping the red light, I shut my eyes, again waiting for the sound of metal on metal as we swung into the near empty car park. The car behind us in close pursuit. Blue lights surrounded our car from what felt like all directions. The sound of sirens was deafening. My dad got straight out of the car and ran behind the car. I screamed, still thinking someone could have a gun, and tried to look over my shoulder to see when my door swung open and a police officer was crouched into the car to help me get out. My arms were completely jelly. I could not even use the crutches to help me stand. Another police officer came, and between them, they helped me as I hopped to the back of the police car. They were kind and tried to distract me as I was trying to see what was going on and where my dad was. I couldn't really see from my angle, and I also couldn't turn properly due to my leg. They did their best to reassure me, and one had clearly just been through the nearby McDonald's drive-thru, offered me his sweet tea. I just sobbed, begging them to tell me what was going on. My dad, after some time, came over to the car and told them to take me home. He had checked, and my mom was back home with my brother. As the police car turned around in the car park back towards the entrance, that we could see the police surrounding the vehicle, and 3 men in what looked to be their late 20s were handcuffed, leaning over the car while a sniffer dog and 2 police officers were taking things out of the car, one of which was a baseball bat. When my dad got home later that night, I asked him what it was about. Who the hell were those men, and why were they following us? He was very reluctant to tell me anything. He did admit it was because of him that they were following us. He explained that he was in a drugs team that dealt with, how I understand this as an adult, the interception of large shipments of drugs that were being transferred across the country, and sometimes people lost a lot of money when they were caught. I just stared at him. I had no idea what to say to this. He just shrugged and said, "Sometimes people get upset about that. Dear drug lords whom my father took your drugs or money from, I'd rather not see you ever again." Around Halloween, when I was about 11, I went to a haunted trail with some friends of mine from karate. Place was your standard higher-end haunted trail. You know the kind, with a heated ticket booth, concession stands, and a fire pit where the performers would take their breaks, as well as people who were cold standing in line. The guy introducing us to the trail told us up front that the actors in the trail wouldn't touch us, and would be fired if they were caught doing so. So we enter the first part of the trail. It's the kind where there's themed structures and areas with a few winding paths through the woods leading between them. The paths were lit with red Christmas lights and had chains laying out the path, so there weren't really any employees on the trails. Just the theme zones at the beginning and the end of the trails. The longest trail through the woods was the one that led from the clown section to the part that had a bunch of people with chainsaws towards the end. Something that's important to know about this place is that it was very professional looking. All the costumes and props would have been props in AHS or Saw or something like that. The clowns all wore old-timey looking costumes that were authentic looking and professionally aged. Plus they all wore makeup, no masks. A few dozen yards after leaving the clown house, a clown wearing a shitty polyester costume and rubber mask that couldn't have costed more than $20 walked out of the woods towards the trail. The fake blood stains on his costume looked like ketchup, not the dark red stuff that stained the other clowns' costumes. I had really long, platinum blonde hair at the time. So this dude stumbles upon me and fucking yoinks my hair and holds it up. He pulls a very real kitchen knife, not painted to look rusty or anything, just a standard 9-inch or so knife with a dark handle, and gets his mask close to me. I could smell whiskey and cigarettes through it. He tells me in a thick southern accent, "You got you some pretty ass hair. I think I'll take me some." He set the hand with the knife on the shoulder, and at this point I stop having a silent, emotional breakdown, and I just tear away from the guy, stomped on his foot, and ran away. This made him drop the knife, which made a light metallic noise when it hit the ground. I heard him yell, "Fucking cunt," while I was running, and watched him slink back into the woods, which was away from the trail, from a safe distance. Never heard anything more from him. When I was little, I just assumed he was a worker that didn't quite understand the rules. But as I got older, I realized 2 things. 1, his shitty costume and real knife wouldn't be allowed in this haunted house. 2, with a better understanding of the area around the haunted trail, I realized there was this trailer park known for drunk redneck antics and meth dealers in the direction that he came from, and he returned to. I really don't think that he was supposed to be there at all. A couple of years back, I was living with two roommates, Emily and Jenna, in a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom apartment. We knew each other from work, and since we were all new to the city we were living in, we figured that it would be most convenient to live with each other. I was the oldest in the apartment at 26. Emily was 23, and Jenna was 21. And let me tell you, there's a huge difference between 26 and 23, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I'd essentially partied myself out at this point. Alcohol. And I had entered into a relationship where a glass or two of wine or a nice bourbon was amenable. But anything more than that would put me on my ass for the foreseeable future. Emily and Jenna still partied like college freshmen, and a lot of their weekends were spent getting drunk, going out, and bringing guys back. No judgment there. I'm all for empowered women doing their thing. Most nights, I would hang with them for the first part, as they pre-gamed at the apartment, and when they went out, I'd wind down and head to bed. At 26, I was a card-carrying member of the Old Lady Society, and I wasn't ashamed of it at all. Some might even say that I was our chapter's president. On one particular night in January, the night played out in its typical way. They headed out to a friend's house, and the bar is around 9:30. I snuggled up with a book and fell asleep around 11:30. Around 4 a.m., I'm woken by some strange noises in my room. I thought it was my hamster, Tater Tot, making noises in her cage. But I knew something was very wrong when I felt my duvet being pulled off of me. My boyfriend at the time was living in a different city, and he wasn't visiting this weekend, so believe me when I say that I was concerned. My eyes popped open to see a pale, skinny, butt-ass naked man pulling my covers off of me and attempting to get into bed next to me. Have you ever had the feeling that your stomach is falling out of your butt? Because yeah, that's what I felt. In that moment, I was utterly and totally convinced that this was my end. I would be raped and murdered in my own bed by a strange man, all before I was able to pay off my student loans. Sorry, Mom, here's another 15 grand that you have to worry about, because your fucking government doesn't think death is a good reason to forgive loans. Once the initial instance of sheer terror wore off a little bit, I realized that this guy was probably a guy that Emily had brought home. Jenna was dating a guy at the time who was around fairly frequently, so I knew him, and this pale stick of a man attempting to get in bed with me was not him. Gathering all of my courage, and metaphorically picking my stomach out of my ass, I tapped him on the arm and said, "No, no, no, stop." He looked at me with those eyes that just tell me that someone is drunk out of their mind. You know, lights on, nobody home kind of deal, and cocked his head to one side like a confused puppy. "Who are you with?" I asked him, a little more forcefully. "Emily," he replied, swaying a little bit. "Yeah, no, this isn't her room, dude. I'm not Emily. She's across the living room." He looked at me for another second, and then with slurred speech, put in a tone that told me he was deeply embarrassed, and said, "Oh shit, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I'll go." He turned on his heels and walked out of my room, closing the door very gently as he did, and his pale bare ass basically glowing in the moonlight, streaming in from my window. I bolted out of bed and locked the door behind him. I definitely didn't want any more surprises that night. I crawled back into bed, heart pounding, and spent the next 30 minutes doing the deep breathing exercises my counselor had taught me to calm myself down enough to fall back asleep. What I think happened is that he got up to pee in the middle of the night and didn't remember where Emily's room was, and so just walked into mine. It's honestly a weird mistake, since Emily's bathroom and her bedroom are literally right next to each other. But since this guy had never been in our apartment before, and he was drunker than a frat boy named Chet, I guess he got confused. In any case, he slipped out of the apartment before I got up that morning, and when I told Emily what had happened, she broke down. She was so upset about what had happened. I still lock my bedroom door to this day, and even though I'm living with my boyfriend who keeps a baseball bat next to the bed just in case we have intruders, I'm glad that it was a mistake, and I'm glad that I wasn't harmed. But man, it was the most scared that I've ever been in my entire life. I went to college in a historic, mid-sized city in Florida, and at the time lived in a duplex downtown. maybe 3 blocks from my campus. The city is known to be pretty safe, and I lived in a pretty decent area with large, historic homes near me. This story takes place around 3 years ago. A little backstory that will become relevant. The duplex I lived in had a front door that locked, and then both the upstairs and downstairs units had their own locking door. I lived downstairs and had 2 roommates, but this specific night, only one of my roommates was home. We knew the girls that lived upstairs, but only really spoke to them in passing. When they moved in, we emphasized how important it was to us for them to keep the main front door locked, and they did a good job of doing so. So me and my roommate are in for the night, knowing the front door is locked, and smoke a few joints. At some point, we hear a knock at the front door, and quickly realize the girls upstairs had ordered a pizza. Later on, it became evident that they never locked the front door after receiving their pizza. So we finally go to sleep in our own rooms, and since I had a queen bed, I would often sleep with my phone and laptop next to me in my bed. A couple hours after I fell asleep, I woke up to a man standing over my bed. As soon as I realize I'm not dreaming, I notice that he is quickly moving my phone and computer off of my bed and moving my comforter, trying to get into my bed. I start to ask him who he is, what he's doing here, and just generally confused, as I was still slightly high from before I went to bed. The only thing that he said to me was, multiple times, was that he was just trying to get into bed. At this point, I begin to panic, as my mind obviously goes to the worst. I was hoping that maybe my roommate had invited some random Tinder guy over, and that he had gone to the wrong room. But the more I questioned him, all he had to say was, I'm just trying to get in bed. I owned pepper spray and a stun gun, but I had accidentally left them on a shelf that the guy was standing in front of, so there was no way that I was able to grab them without escalating the situation. Realizing I need to do something quickly, I blurted, there are 5 people who live in this house, and if you don't get the fuck out now, I will scream, and they will all be here within seconds. Luckily, that was all it took to scare him off. I don't know if he had brought something with him, or if he stole something from me, but I saw him grab something in the dark and run out of my room. As soon as he left my room, I shut the door and locked it, and tried to find my phone. I couldn't find it anywhere, but then quickly realized that between my room and the front door is the room of my friend that was home. As scared as I was terrified that the guy had maybe gone into her room. So I grabbed my stun gun and a pocket knife, counting to 3, and ripped open my door. I ran into my roommate's room, and she was fast asleep, and there was no evidence of the guy. I told her what happened. She asked me if I was sure I wasn't dreaming. I began to question myself until I walked out of her room and saw that our front door was wide open. I went to my room to search for my phone, and finally find it hidden under a pile of clothes across the room from where I had left it. That sent a chill up my spine, as I immediately knew for a fact someone had been in my house and my room while I was sleeping, long enough to hide my phone, which only worsened my suspicion of this intention. I ran to my roommate's room, who at this point believed me, barricaded ourselves into the room, and called 911. Within minutes, there were police cars swarming our street and yard, and they yelled for us to quickly leave the residence and run towards them. At least a dozen police officers came running in and searched every inch of our apartment, woke up the girls upstairs, and searched their apartment to ensure that the man had left. The officers then had me write a statement, and I gave them a description of the man, who to this day I've never heard a single thing about the case. I feel incredibly lucky with the outcome of the situation, but the thought of his intentions terrify me. Additionally, the fact that he was never caught scares me, as I would hate for anyone to go through the pure fear that I did. I will add, there is a chance that he was on drugs, or mentally ill, and had no bad intentions. However, because he was never caught, I will never know, and my mind will always assume the worst. To the man who keeps me up at night, please don't come back into my apartment ever again. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night, and I'll see you next time.